This is a real interview, translated into English. You can find the original story via the link in the description. Hi, my name is Alina. I currently live in Turkey, and I've been here for a little over 4 years now. I moved here from Russia, from the city of Kostroma. At the moment, Turkey is the country where my everyday life is based. This is where I study, live, and deal with all the usual responsibilities of adult life. When I first arrived, everything felt very new and intense. Moving to another country meant handling a lot of paperwork, new rules, and unfamiliar systems. At times, it was easy to feel overwhelmed, especially during the first months when nothing felt stable yet. Still, step by step, I managed to sort things out. It took me a while to feel fully settled and understand how life here works, but over time, Turkey became a place where I could function calmly and confidently. The main reason I moved to Turkey was education. From the beginning, my plan was very clear. I wanted to study abroad and get a degree in another country. I applied to a university in Turkey and was accepted before I moved. So when I arrived, I already knew that I had a place at the university and a clear goal ahead of me. It wasn't a spontaneous move. It was a conscious decision connected to my studies. Of course, preparing for this move wasn't easy. There was a lot of paperwork, documents, deadlines, and requirements that needed attention. At some points, the whole process felt overwhelmed, especially because I was doing this for the first time and didn't fully understand how everything worked yet. Still, I was motivated. I knew why I was doing this, and I was ready to sort things out step by step. It took me a while to fully realize what studying abroad actually means in practice, but the decision itself felt right from the start. When I arrived in Turkey, I didn't know Turkish at all. Literally zero. Because of that, the university automatically gave me an academic leave for 1 year. This is a standard practice here for foreign students who don't speak the language yet. It wasn't something I had to negotiate or request myself. The university already had this system in place. They understand that without the language, studying right away would be extremely difficult. Looking back, I think it's a very reasonable approach. At first, the idea of taking a whole year just to learn the language felt strange. I was a bit overwhelmed because everything was new. A new country, a new system, and a completely unfamiliar language. But very quickly, I realized that this year was actually necessary. There was also quite a bit of paperwork involved in arranging the academic leave and updating my student status, but the university handled most of it. I mostly just had to follow instructions and sort things out step by step. It took me a while to accept that this pause wasn't a delay, but an important part of the process. Without that year, it would have been almost impossible to continue studying comfortably later. I studied Turkish at Tomer, which is a language center located directly at the university. I chose these courses quite consciously, mainly because they were officially connected to my university. The biggest advantage was that after graduating from Tomer, I didn't need to take any additional language exams. Everything was recognized internally. That made the whole process much simpler and removed a lot of unnecessary stress. Even so, studying the language wasn't easy. The courses were taught entirely in Turkish, which at the beginning felt extremely challenging. I often felt overwhelmed, especially during the first months, because you don't know the language, yet the language is used to explain itself. There was also a lot of paperwork related to enrollment, exams, and course completion. But since Tomer was part of the university system, it was easier to sort things out compared to external language schools. It took me a while to get used to the structure and pace of the courses, but step by step, things started to make sense. By the end of the program, I already felt much more confident and prepared to begin my university studies in Turkish. Both my language courses and my university education in Turkey were paid. I studied Turkish on a paid basis, and I also pay tuition at the university. In Turkey, there is no system where foreign students can study for free. Whether the university is public or private, international students are required to pay tuition. The difference is mainly in the price. Private universities are much more expensive, while public universities are more affordable. Even so, at the beginning, dealing with all of this felt quite intense. New rules, new payments, documents, deadlines. It was easy to feel overwhelmed, especially when you've just arrived in a new country and don't fully understand how the system works yet. There was also a fair amount of paperwork involved: contracts, payment confirmations, student status documents. At first, it took me a while to sort things out because everything was new and unfamiliar. It took me a while to fully accept that studying abroad as a foreigner means constant expenses and responsibility. But once I understood the structure, how tuition works, and what exactly I'm paying for, the situation became much clearer and less stressful. Overall, compared to many other countries, studying in Turkey is still relatively affordable, especially at public universities, which was an important factor for me when making this choice. The cost of education in Turkey depends a lot on the year you enroll. This is something many people don't expect at first. When I enrolled 4 years ago, my tuition fee was much lower than it is for new students today. Every year, the price gets recalculated and usually increases a little. However, students continue paying according to the year they were accepted, not according to current prices. For example, right now, I pay about 3,000 Turkish lira per semester, which is roughly 100 US dollars. But one of my classmates, he's also Russian, although he has Turkish citizenship, enrolled a year later. We study at the same university, on the same faculty, and in the same year. Yet he pays around 7,000 lira per semester. When I first realized how big the difference was, I honestly felt a bit overwhelmed. It took me a while to sort things out and understand how this system works and why the prices are so different. Today, the situation is even more extreme. For students who are enrolling now, tuition fees can reach around 100,000 lira per year, which is a massive jump compared to what it was a few years ago. There is also quite a lot of paperwork involved every year: updated contracts, payment confirmations, and official university documents. It took me a while to get used to the fact that prices constantly change and that inflation affects education very directly here. So, yes, studying in Turkey can still be affordable, but only if you enrolled earlier. For new students, the financial situation looks very different now, and that's something you really need to consider before making a decision. I chose Turkey very consciously. First of all, I wanted to live in a place with a warm climate: sun, sea, mountains, and a generally pleasant environment. That was extremely important for me on a personal level. I knew I wouldn't feel comfortable in a cold or gray country long term. I also looked at education options in Europe. I spent quite a lot of time researching different countries and universities. But compared to Europe, Turkey was much more affordable at that time. Tuition fees, living costs, and everyday expenses were significantly lower, which made the move more realistic for me and my family. At the beginning, I had to sort things out in my head: what I really wanted, what I could realistically afford, and what kind of life I imagined for myself. When I put everything together, Turkey simply made sense. Of course, moving to another country always feels stressful. There were moments when I felt overwhelmed, especially when I started thinking about all the logistics: relocation, studies, documents, and adapting to a new culture. But the overall picture still felt right. I also understood that there would be a lot of paperwork involved. visas, university documents, residence permits, and that this would take time and patience. It took me a while to fully accept that moving abroad isn't just about beautiful weather and new experiences, but also about bureaucracy and responsibility. Still, when I compared all the options, Turkey felt like the best balance between quality of life, education, and affordability. That's why, in the end, I chose this country and decided to take the risk. I didn't handle the whole application process on my own. At that time, I found help completely by chance. I came across a woman named Anna who helped students with documents and university applications in Turkey. She assisted me with all the paperwork, university documents, applications, and bureaucratic steps. Back then, there were almost no people offering this kind of help for Turkey, so finding her was really lucky for me. I was fully satisfied with how everything went. The main problem was the language barrier. I didn't know Turkish at all, and in Turkey, especially in Antalya, most official institutions don't really use English. Even if someone understands you, they usually don't try very hard to explain things in English. Because of that, doing everything alone would have been extremely difficult. Without knowing the language, it's very hard to sort things out on your own, especially when it comes to official procedures. At that stage, I felt quite overwhelmed by all the bureaucratic processes. There were too many documents, rules, and deadlines at once. It took me a while to understand how the system works and feel more confident dealing with these things. Having someone who could guide me through this process made a huge difference. Without that help, adapting to life in Turkey would have been much more stressful. I applied to the university while still being in Russia. Before moving, I already knew that I had been accepted, but admission itself was based on an entrance exam, not just a school diploma. In my case, I had to take the YÖS exam, which is an entrance exam specifically for international students. At that time, admission to public universities in Turkey was mainly possible only through this exam. The option to apply just with a diploma appeared later, but it didn't exist when I was applying. I took the YÖS exam in Moscow. Each country usually has specific exam centers, and for Russia, Moscow was the location where the exam was held. You register in advance, come on a specific day, and take the exam, which lasts several hours. The exam itself is quite different from what we are used to. It focuses on mathematics and logic rather than memorization. Because of that, it's not something you can just show up to and pass easily without preparation. At first, the whole process felt confusing. There were rules, deadlines, registration steps, and a lot of paperwork involved. I had to sort things out step by step and make sure I didn't miss anything important. I remember feeling quite overwhelmed at that stage because I was preparing for multiple exams at the same time and also trying to understand how the Turkish system works. It took me a while to fully understand how the YÖS exam works and what exactly was expected from me. Still, once I figured out the structure and requirements, everything became more manageable. The key was preparation and not underestimating the process. The YÖS exam is actually quite challenging, especially for students who come from the Russian education system. We are simply not used to this format. The exam consists mainly of mathematics and logical reasoning tasks. If mathematics was at least somewhat familiar to me, logic tasks were a completely different story. These were not the kinds of problems we usually solve at school. I personally had almost no experience with this type of logic questions before. I clearly remember writing to Anna before I even started preparing. At that moment, I had only 2 or 3 months left before the exam. She told me that most people prepare for YÖS for at least 6 months. Hearing that, I honestly felt overwhelmed because I had very little time. At the same time, Yuz was not my main priority at first. My parents insisted that I focus primarily on my national exams in Russia because I had been preparing for them for years with tutors. Yuz was more like a backup option. If it worked out, great. If not, then at least I still had another path. So I had to sort things out quickly and figure out how to prepare efficiently in a very limited time frame. I mostly studied on my own. I searched for videos online. Many of them were in Turkish, even though I didn't know the language yet. I just watched how problems were solved and tried to understand the logic by analogy. I also found a Yuz preparation book called Metropole. I contacted another girl who was also preparing for the exam, and she shared some example tasks with me. Step by step, I started to understand how the exam works. It wasn't easy at all. I was preparing for my Russian exams during the day, and in the evenings and at night, I worked on Yuz tasks. It took me a while to get used to this exam format and stop panicking when I saw logic questions. Time pressure was one of the hardest parts. Just like many Turkish exams, Yuz gives you very little time. There is almost no time to sit and think calmly. Everything has to be solved quickly. Despite all of this, I managed to prepare in about 2 months. It was intense and exhausting, but it was real. Difficult, yes. Impossible? No. Moving to Turkey without knowing the language was emotionally intense. A lot depended on my mindset at that time. I moved with huge motivation and a very strong desire to live here. For me, this move felt like a dream finally coming true. Because of that, at the beginning, I was in a kind of euphoria. Even when difficulties appeared, I still felt happy just to be here. I liked everything around me, and I was ready to accept challenges. But reality, of course, came very quickly. When you arrive in a new country and you don't know the language, don't know how things work, and don't know anyone, it's hard. When I moved, I had no relatives, no friends, no acquaintances at all. I was completely alone. That period was especially difficult because I had just turned 18. It was one of the hardest stages of my life. You suddenly realize that you have to handle everything yourself. Studies, everyday life, documents, communication. All the paperwork, daily tasks, and basic things felt heavy at first. There were moments when I felt truly overwhelmed. Simple things like going to a store, asking for help, or dealing with documents required a lot of effort. Turkish wasn't just not fluent, I didn't know it at all. And English, which I expected to rely on, turned out to be almost useless outside hotels. It really took me a while to emotionally adapt to this new reality. The excitement slowly mixed with loneliness and confusion. I had to sort things out step by step. How to live here, how to communicate, how to survive day to day. Still, that strong internal motivation helped me a lot. Even when it was hard, I didn't think about giving up. I knew that this stage would pass, and eventually, it did. The hardest period of adaptation lasted for about 2 or 3 months after I arrived. That was the time when the initial excitement slowly faded and reality fully set in. At first, I didn't know anyone at all. No friends, no familiar faces, no support system. You wake up in a new country and everything around you feels unfamiliar. Even small, everyday things felt difficult. I constantly had to sort things out on my own. Where to go, how to do things, who to ask, and how to explain myself. Emotionally, that period was very heavy. I often felt overwhelmed, especially because I couldn't communicate properly. I had expected that English would help me, since Antalya is a very tourist-oriented city. But that expectation turned out to be wrong. To my surprise and disappointment, almost no one spoke English outside of hotels. In shops, cafes, government offices, English simply didn't work. That was a shock for me. I realized very quickly that without Turkish, life here would be extremely complicated. Because of this, even basic paperwork or simple daily interactions became stressful. You can't explain what you need, you can't ask questions properly, and you constantly feel insecure. It really took me a while to stop feeling anxious every time I had to leave the house. Things started to change once I began language courses. At Tomer, I slowly met new people, made friends, and finally felt less alone. Little by little, daily life became more manageable, and emotionally, it got easier. Those first months were tough, but they were also very important. They taught me independence, patience, and resilience. Looking back now, I understand that this stage was unavoidable, and it played a big role in shaping who I am today. When I first started learning Turkish, it felt extremely difficult. There were so many rules, endings, and structures. And at the beginning, it was honestly overwhelming. What made it even harder was the fact that the courses were taught entirely in Turkish. So you don't know the language yet, and the language is being explained in the same language. At the A1 level, this was especially challenging. I only knew the alphabet and a few basic words, and suddenly, I was expected to understand grammar explanations, instructions, and examples. Because of that, the lessons alone were not enough for me. When I came home after classes, I had to do a lot of extra work. I translated rules, memorized new words, and watched additional lessons on YouTube in Russian. Without that, I simply couldn't sort things out in my head. Sometimes I would sit and think, how is it even possible to apply this rule in real speech? At first, speaking was the hardest part. I knew the rules, but when it came to actually talking, my brain froze. I had to think about every single word, every ending, every sentence. I felt completely overwhelmed, especially in real-life conversations, where there's no time to think slowly. There was also a strong speaking barrier. For a long time, I barely spoke Turkish at all. Understanding improved earlier than speaking. Over time, after listening to lectures, conversations, and everyday speech, I started to understand almost everything. But speaking lagged behind. It really took me a while to feel comfortable talking without constantly thinking about grammar. One day, I suddenly realized that I was speaking automatically, without translating in my head, without panic. That's when things finally clicked. Looking back, I can say this. The first stage was very hard, especially for Russian speakers, because Turkish has almost nothing in common with Russian. But if you give yourself time and don't panic, progress comes. Slowly, naturally, and almost without you noticing it. I study political science and public administration at Akdeniz University in Antalya. To be honest, I can't say that the education fully met my expectations. I was hoping for a bit more depth and structure. Very often, it feels like there are a lot of exams, but not enough time to properly cover the material before them. You're expected to absorb a lot on your own, and sometimes it feels rushed. That said, I wouldn't say the education is terrible. It's manageable. If you sit down, study regularly, and really try to sort things out, you can pass your courses without major problems. On average, my grades are around a 7 out of 10, which I think is realistic for an international student studying in a non-native language. The professors are very different. Some of them are genuinely understanding and supportive. They realize that for foreign students, Turkish is not a native language, and they try to help, explaining things again, being a bit more flexible, or even asking senior students to support someone who is struggling. I remember one case when a professor asked me to contact a younger student from another year because her Turkish was very weak and she was completely lost. Moments like that really matter. They make you feel seen and supported. At the same time, there are professors who treat everyone exactly the same, without taking language difficulties into account. No flexibility, no adjustments. You're either keeping up or you're not. Sometimes that can feel a bit unfair, especially when you're already overwhelmed with lectures, exams, and constant studying in a foreign language. Still, I wouldn't say that students are massively failing or dropping out. The system is demanding, but overall, it's doable. If you attend classes, study consistently, and don't ignore the workload, you can get through it. For me, it really took me a while to adapt to the pace and expectations of university life here. At first, everything felt confusing. The schedule, exams, requirements, academic rules. But over time, you get used to it, learn how the system works, and it becomes much more predictable. So, overall, university life here is not easy, but it's realistic. You just need patience, discipline, and the ability to handle pressure without giving up. When it comes to life in Turkey overall, I'd say that over the past 4 years, things have changed very noticeably, and not always for the better. When I first moved here, the cost of living was much lower. Prices, exchange rates, rent, everything felt more manageable. Over time, inflation has really hit hard. Living expenses have increased significantly, and for many people, this has become a serious issue. I see friends and acquaintances either leaving Turkey or seriously thinking about it, because financially, it no longer makes as much sense as it used to. For me personally, Turkey feels more like a transitional stage rather than a place where I want to stay forever. It's a good country to start, to study, adapt, and gain experience, but I don't really see it as my final destination. And from what I've noticed, many people around me feel the same way. A lot of students come here knowing from the start that this is just a step before moving on to Europe or another country. Working during studies in Turkey is quite difficult for international students. Officially, your options are very limited. Employers rarely want to deal with visas and contracts for part-time positions. Because of that, most students either don't work at all or try to find online jobs. I also worked online for a period of time, but definitely not during my first year. Back then, I was already overwhelmed with language learning, studies, and everyday adaptation. Living here teaches you to be independent very quickly. You have to deal with a lot of paperwork, especially when it comes to residence permits, university documents, and renewals. At first, all of this felt confusing and stressful. Honestly, it took me a while to understand how the system works and how to sort things out without panicking every time. If I could give advice to people who are planning to move to Turkey, it would be this. Don't be afraid of the initial difficulties. The first months can be tough, emotionally, mentally, and financially. Some people can't handle it and decide to go back. That's okay. It really depends on your inner motivation. But if moving abroad is something you truly want, if it's not just a random idea but a real goal, then these difficulties will pass. They don't last forever. Over time, you adapt, become stronger, and gain experience that changes you as a person. Turkey may not be a perfect country, and life here is not as easy as it might look from the outside. But as a step, as a place to grow, learn, and prepare for what's next, it can be very valuable. My name is Artyom, and I've done around 2,000 interviews with people who moved to completely different countries. I hope you enjoyed this story, and that it maybe helped you improve your English. Don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.